The Young and the Restless spoilers full. This room officially became a room full of drama, and the writer might just tear the Abbott family apart. Patty and Jack seemed to have realized the truth about Kyle's identity. Jack knew, but he had kept it hidden for so many years. When Kyle and Diane appeared in the room, Patty was unusually calm. She showed no fear, and she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. She rushed forward and embraced Kyle in astonishment. "My son, what the hell?" Before anyone could react to stop her, she was close enough to touch him, gently stroking his cheek as if confirming something she had been harboring for years. The gesture was intimate, almost maternal, and it made Kyle instinctively recoil in confusion. In tears and frantic sobs, Patty wrapped her arms around him and clung to him with intense despair. Her voice trembled as she uttered words that tore through the air. "Kyle is my son who was kidnapped shortly after he was born. The secret of that year has been revealed." "Diane, tell me the truth." Diane stood frozen, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was witnessing. She was terrified. She couldn't believe that the woman from the past was Patty, and that she had come here to reclaim what belonged to her. She demanded to know what was happening, her eyes darting back and forth between Jack and Patty, as if waiting for someone to laugh and admit that it was just some twisted misunderstanding. Kyle himself looked completely stunned. He called out to Diane, wanting confirmation. Diane remained silent. Was that the answer? Every memory, every moment of his childhood, every piece of his identity was built upon that truth. Patty's assertion sounded insane, like the ramblings of someone who had proven their ability to manipulate and cause chaos. Jack said he hadn't expected Patty to return, and now the Abbott family was plunged into fear and despair. Billy stood beside him, understanding everything. His shoulders trembled as he bowed his head, and when he finally spoke, his words came out slowly, painfully, each word heavier than the last. He admitted the truth. Kyle wasn't Diane's biological son. The confession struck like a bolt of lightning, shattering the fragile stability that still lingered in the room. Diane covered her mouth in astonishment, her eyes widening as the meaning of Jack's words slowly sank into her mind. For a moment, she looked as if she had lost her balance. The foundation of her emotional world seemed to crumble in an instant. Her hands instinctively went to her face as tears began to stream down her cheeks, the pain stemming not only from the betrayal, but also from the shattering of a truth she had believed in for decades. Why was Patty my biological mother, and why didn't Diane give birth to me? These were the questions Kyle wanted answered. The atmosphere was filled with heart-wrenching sobs, tearing apart hatred. No one cared anymore that Patty and Jack had slept together. However, Patty wouldn't let go. She continued to hold Kyle tightly as if he would disappear if she loosened her grip. Her tears flowed even more profusely, her sobs shaking her entire being. In her mind, this moment seemed to symbolize a long-awaited reunion rather than a horrifying truth. She kept repeating that he was her son, that she had always known the truth, that fate had finally brought them together again. Her emotional intensity only made the situation worse. Diane slumped into a nearby chair, her hands still covering her face as she sobbed uncontrollably. The pain she felt wasn't simply jealousy or anger. It was the anguish of a mother suddenly learning that the child she had raised, protected, and loved with all her heart wasn't actually her biological child. Every memory she had built with Kyle now seemed fragile, threatened by a biological truth she had never known. Her heart shattered in that moment, not only because of Jack's betrayal, but also because the very foundation of her life as a mother had been shaken. Jack wiped his face, trying to regain his composure to continue speaking. He knew that words alone couldn't heal the wounds he had just inflicted, but he also knew that the truth couldn't be kept any longer. Years of secrecy had caused too much devastation. His voice was hoarse as he tried to regain his composure and explain what needed to happen next. They needed proof. He said the only way to end the confusion and confirm the truth was to go to the hospital and get a DNA test. A blood test would reveal everything. There would be no room for doubt once the results were available. Jack's words sounded almost desperate, as if he hoped science could somehow alleviate the mental anguish unfolding around them. Kyle looked at him with utter disbelief. Part of him wanted to leave the room and pretend nothing had happened. Another part wanted to demand answers until the whole story became clear. The heavy oak door of the yacht's master cabin swung open, hitting the bulkhead with a hollow, resounding thud. Kyle Abbott stood paralyzed in the threshold, the damp Lake Michigan breeze at his back doing nothing to dispel the suffocating drug-laced heat radiating from inside. His breath hitched in his throat. The sight before him defied all logic, a grotesque tableau that made the blood roar in his ears. There amidst the tangled silk sheets of the bed was his father, Jack Abbott, disheveled, groggy, his eyes wide with a hazy drug-induced panic. And clinging to him, her hair a wild mane of chaotic blonde, was Patty Williams. Dad Kyle's voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the heavy silence of the cabin like a serrated blade. Behind Kyle, the frantic footsteps of Diane Jenkins, Abbott echoed down the narrow corridor. Kyle, what is it? Did you find? Diane's voice died in her throat as she pushed past her son. Her designer purse slipped from her fingers, hitting the floorboards. Oh my God, Diane gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Jack, what has this psycho done to you? But before Diane could lunge forward, Patty's head snapped toward the doorway. The manic, obsessive gleam in Patty's eyes, usually reserved solely for Jack, shifted. It locked onto Kyle. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Patty's trembling hands released their iron grip on Jack's shirt. She scrambled off the bed, her movements erratic, her breathing shallow and fast. Kyle. Patty breathed the name, tumbling from her lips, with a reverence that made Kyle's skin crawl. My beautiful boy. Get away from him, Patty, Diane shrieked, stepping in front of Kyle like a lioness protecting her cub. Don't you dare look at my son. You drugged my husband, you kidnapped him, and now you... He's not your son, Patty's voice erupted, a guttural, agonizing scream that tore through the cabin. The sheer force of her conviction silenced Diane instantly. Patty pushed past Diane with a frantic, desperate strength, throwing herself at Kyle. Her arms wrapped around his rigid body, her face burying into his chest as she began to sob uncontrollably. My baby, my sweet, perfect baby boy, I knew you would come. I knew we would be a family again. Kyle stood frozen, his arms hovering awkwardly in the air, repulsed yet entirely paralyzed by the surreal nature of the moment. Get off me, he choked out, trying to pry her claw-like grip from his jacket. Mom, get her off me. Patty, have you completely lost your mind? Diane screamed, grabbing Patty's shoulder and wrenching her back. Kyle is times my time, son, mine and Jack's. You are a delusional, sick woman. Patty stumbled back, tears streaming down her flushed cheeks, but a terrifyingly lucid smile stretched across her face. She looked past Diane, her gaze fixing on the man still struggling to sit up on the bed. Tell them, Jack, Patty whispered, her voice trembling with a lifetime of suppressed agony. Tell them the truth. Tell them what we did. Tell Diane that the boy she raised, the boy she loves, came from my womb. Diane let out a harsh, breathless laugh, looking at Jack. Jack, say something. Tell this lunatic to shut her mouth. Tell her. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Kyle had ever heard. He looked at his father, expecting the righteous indignation, the booming Abbott authority that Jack always commanded when defending his family. He expected Jack to throw Patty out to comfort Diane, to assure Kyle that this was just another one of Patty Williams' psychotic delusions. Instead, Jack Abbott lowered his head into his hands and a jagged, gut-wrenching sob tore from his throat. Dad, Kyle's voice cracked. The floor beneath him felt as though it were pitching violently, though the yacht was perfectly still. Dad, tell her she's crazy. Jack slowly lifted his head. His face was ashen, aged a decade in a matter of seconds. Tears carved shiny tracks down his weathered cheeks, his eyes reflecting a profound, crushing shame. He looked at Diane, whose expression was morphing from furious indignation to a creeping absolute terror, and then he looked at Kyle. I'm so sorry, Jack wept, his voice breaking on every syllable. I am so sorry. No, Diane whispered, stumbling backward until her back hit the mahogany wall of the cabin. No, Jack, no. What are you saying? I gave birth to him. I remember the hospital. I remember... You gave birth to a child, Diane. Jack choked out the words, seeming to physically pain him, but he didn't survive. He died hours after he was born. You were sedated. You were so fragile. Jack's hands shook violently as he reached out into the empty space between them. Patty was in the same hospital. She had just given birth to a boy. My boy. We had a brief encounter during one of her lucid periods. When I found out her baby was mine and that she was being committed to the psychiatric ward, I couldn't let my son grow up in the system. I couldn't let him be a ward of the state or raised by a woman who didn't know her own name half the time. So you stole him, Patty shrieked, her sorrow turning to sudden, blinding rage. You told me he died. You told me my baby was dead. I protected him, Jack roared back, tears flying from his eyes. I gave him a life. I gave him a mother who could care for him. Diane's baby had just died and Patty was being locked away. I paid the doctors. I switched the records. I gave Kyle the life he deserved. The confession hung in the stale air, a toxic cloud that suffocated everyone in the room. Diane let out a sound that wasn't human, a high, keening wail of pure, unadulterated agony. Her legs gave out from under her and she collapsed to the floor, her hands flying to her face, her fingers digging into her skin as if trying to tear away the reality of what she had just heard. She rocked back and forth, sobbing hysterically, the foundation of her entire existence instantly pulverized. Everything she had fought for, all the schemes, the love, the redemption she had sought in Genoa City, it was all anchored to her identity as Kyle's mother. And it was a lie. A 30-year-old lie orchestrated by the man she had just married. Kyle felt his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked at his hands, his arms, his reflection in the mirror on the closet door. He was Kyle Abbott. He was the golden boy of Jabot Cosmetics. He was the son of Jack and Diane. He was not the offspring of a notorious, unstable woman who had terrorized his family for decades. He couldn't be. "This is insane!" Kyle breathed, his voice eerily calmed the shock, acting as a temporary anesthetic. "This is completely insane. You're drugged, Dad. Patty gave you something and you're hallucinating." "That's it. That's the only explanation." "Kyle," Jack pleaded, pushing himself off the bed, his legs unsteady. "Kyle, please. I did it for you." "Don't touch me," Kyle shouted, recoiling so violently he slammed into the door frame. "Don't you dare touch me. You're lying. You have to be lying." Jack wiped his face, his jaw trembling as he tried to summon whatever shreds of authority he had left. The guilt was eating him alive, but he knew the damage was done. The Pandora's box was open and there was no closing it. "There is only one way to settle this," Jack said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, defeated whisper. "We can't leave it like this. We need proof. We are going to the hospital. Right now. We are getting a DNA test." Diane looked up through her fingers, her mascara running in thick black rivers down her face. Her eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, were hollow, empty voids. "A test," she mocked, her voice laced with a venom so pure it made Jack flinch. "You want a test, Jack? To prove what? To prove that you are a monster who stole a baby and handed him to a grieving mother like a replacement part." "Diane, please." "Don't speak to me," she shrieked, scrambling to her feet. "Don't you ever speak to me again." The journey back to Genoa City was a descent into hell. The silence in the car was absolute broken. Only by Patty's occasional muffled whimpers from the back seat where she sat staring at the back of Kyle's head with an intense, unwavering devotion. Kyle sat in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed blindly on the passing highway, his mind a chaotic whirlwind of fragmented memories. Every birthday, every mother-son dance, every time Diane had looked at him with pride, it was all built on the bones of a dead infant he had replaced. He felt physically sick. Genoa City Memorial Hospital was a stark contrast to the dark, oppressive atmosphere of the yacht. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare on the 4 fractured souls sitting in the private waiting room. Jack had used his considerable influence to bypass the usual channels, demanding a rapid emergency DNA sequence from the hospital's chief of staff. Blood was drawn, swabs were taken, and then the waiting began. For 2 agonizing hours no one spoke. Diane sat in the farthest corner of the room, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, her eyes fixed on the linoleum floor. She looked like a ghost, a shell of the vibrant, formidable woman who had stormed the marina just hours before. Jack paced the length of the room, his footsteps heavy, his shoulders bowed under the weight of his sins. He tried to catch Kyle's eye, but Kyle refused to look at him. Kyle stood by the window, staring out into the night, feeling as though he were slowly dissolving into nothingness. If he wasn't Diane's son, who was he? How much of Patty's instability, her darkness, her madness was coursing through his veins at this very moment? Patty sat rigidly in a plastic chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was terrifyingly calm, now a serene smile playing on her lips. She had won. After years of being cast aside, of being labeled the villain, the crazy woman, she had finally reclaimed her ultimate prize. The heavy wooden door clicked open, and Dr. Hastings stepped into the room, a manila folder clutched in his hands. The air in the room instantly vanished. Jack stopped pacing. Diane slowly raised her head. Kyle turned from the window, his breath catching in his throat. "I have the results," Dr. Hastings said softly, his eyes darting uncomfortably between Jack, Diane, and Patty. He was well aware of the Abbott family dynamics, and he knew the nuclear payload contained within the folder he held. "Read them," Kyle demanded, his voice hard, devoid of any emotion. "Just read them." Dr. Hastings opened the folder, adjusting his glasses. He cleared his throat. "We ran a comprehensive comparative analysis between the DNA samples provided by Kyle Abbott, Diane Jenkins, and Patty Williams. The results are conclusive." He paused, looking directly at Kyle with an expression of profound sympathy. "The probability of maternity between Diane Jenkins and Kyle Abbott is 0%. Diane Jenkins is not the biological mother." A sharp, breathless gasp escaped Diane's lips, followed by a low, guttural moan that sounded like a dying animal. She doubled over, clutching her stomach as if she had been physically disemboweled. "The probability of maternity," Dr. Hastings continued, his voice wavering slightly between Patty Williams and Kyle Abbott, "is 99.99%. Patty Williams is the biological mother." "My boy Patty," whispered, tears of joy spilling over her eyelashes. She stood up, taking a tentative step toward Kyle. "My beautiful boy." "Don't," Kyle warned, holding up a shaking hand. His voice was dangerously quiet. "Do not come near me." He looked at the piece of paper in the doctor's hand, the black and white ink that had just obliterated his entire existence. The DNA results didn't just confirm a biological fact, they shattered the very foundation of the Abbott family. The legacy, the bloodline, the trust, all of it was reduced to ash in a matter of seconds. "Kyle, Jack," said his voice, pleading, tears streaming down his face once more. He reached out, desperate to bridge the yawning chasm that had just opened between them. "Kyle, please listen to me. You are my son. You are an Abbott. Nothing changes that. I raised you. I love you." "You lied to me, Kyle," exploded the anesthetic of shock, wearing off, replaced by a blinding white-hot rage. He lunged forward, grabbing Jack by the lapels of his jacket, slamming him against the wall of the waiting room. "You lied to me my entire life. You let me believe. You let her believe." He pointed a trembling finger at Diane, who was sobbing uncontrollably on the floor. "You played God, Dad. You stole a baby, and you played God." "I was protecting you," Jack cried, not resisting Kyle's grip. "Look at her, Kyle. Look at Patty. She was institutionalized. She was a danger to herself and everyone around her. I couldn't let my son be destroyed by her madness." "So you destroyed us instead," Kyle roared, shoving Jack away in disgust. "You destroyed Mom. You let her mourn a child she didn't even know she lost while she raised another woman's baby. You're a coward, Jack. You're a selfish, arrogant coward." "Kyle, no." Diane moaned from the floor, struggling to her knees. Her face was a mask of pure devastation, but as she looked at Jack, the sorrow began to curdle into a dark, venomous hatred. She slowly pushed herself to her feet, her eyes locking onto her husband. The man she had defended, the man she had loved, the man she had fought the world to be with. "You," Diane hissed, her voice vibrating with a terrifying intensity. She walked toward Jack, her steps slow, deliberate. "You let me hold him. You let me nurse him. You watched me cry tears of joy over a baby that wasn't mine, knowing my real child was dead in a morgue somewhere. You watched me fight Patty. You watched her try to destroy my life, knowing all along she was his mother. Diane, I swear to you, I wanted to tell you." To smack, Diane's hand cracked across Jack's face with the force of a gunshot. Jack's head snapped to the side, a red mark instantly blooming on his cheek. But Diane wasn't finished. She lunged at him, her fist flying, pounding against his chest, his face screaming incoherently. Jack didn't fight back. He simply took the blows, a pathetic martyr to his own deceit. "I hate you," Diane shrieked, her nails digging into his skin. "I hate you, Jack Abbott. I will never forgive you for this. You are dead to me. Do you hear me? Dead." She spun around, her wild eyes landing on Patty. Patty stood there, clutching her hands to her chest, looking at Diane with a sickening mixture of pity and triumph. "And you, Diane," spat her voice, dropping to a lethal whisper. "You psychotic, miserable bitch. You think you've won. You think because you share blood with him he's yours. You destroyed my happiness. You destroyed my family. But I promise you, Patty Williams, I will spend the rest of my miserable life making sure you burn in hell for this." Diane didn't wait for a response. She turned on her heel and fled the room, her sobs echoing down the sterile hospital corridor, a haunting melody of a woman whose mind was fracturing beyond repair. The mental breakdown that had been held at bay by her sheer willpower had finally breached the gates. Diane Jenkins was gone, consumed by a hatred and a grief so profound it would rewrite the rest of her life. In the waiting room, the silence returned heavier and more suffocating than before. The Abbott family, a dynasty built on loyalty, power, and love, lay in ruins on the linoleum floor. The relationships that had defined them, Jack and Diane's enduring, complicated love, Jack and Kyle's unbreakable father-son bond, were irrevocably, permanently severed. Kyle stood in the center of the room, completely alone despite the presence of his biological parents. He looked at Jack, a man he no longer recognized, a man whose legacy was now stained with an unforgivable sin. Then he looked at Patty, the woman whose blood pumped through his heart, whose madness might be lurking in his own DNA, waiting to surface. He was Kyle Abbott, but he was also Kyle Williams. He was the product of obsession, deceit, and a stolen life. "Kyle," Patty whispered, taking a step toward him, her hand outstretched. "We can go home now. We can be together." Kyle looked at her outstretched hand, feeling a wave of nausea wash over him. He didn't say a word. He didn't have any words left. He simply turned his back on both of them and walked out of the room, stepping into a future that stood on the edge of a terrifying, bottomless abyss. The Abbott family was broken, perhaps forever, and as Kyle walked out into the cold Genoa City night, he realized the hardest battle was yet to come, figuring out who the hell he really was. The legacy of Jabot, the wealth, the name, it all meant nothing now. The truth had set no one free. It had only locked them all in a prison of Jack Abbott's making. And as the doors of the hospital slid shut behind him, Kyle knew that nothing in his life would ever be the same again.